Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. Our story started off like any other couples, full of optimism and certainty that we could beat the odds. Over the years, we grew together and weathered the small storms that hit every marriage. Sure, we had our share of disagreements, especially after our second child was born. But I never thought it would come to this. It all began subtly enough, without a scene or a dramatic moment. My wife, Claire, had always been an early riser, getting up to hit the gym or dive into her work before the kids woke up. So when she started staying out late, claiming she had work dinners and networking events, I didn't question it. She's in marketing, late nights come with the territory, right? That's what I told myself, though a small voice in the back of my mind wondered why these nights out seemed to be happening more and more often. The clues began piling up in the oddest ways. It wasn't her behavior, exactly, she was good at hiding things, maintaining her routine, and playing the devoted wife and mother. But every now and then, a detail would slip. I'd notice a missed call from an unfamiliar number on her phone, or I'd catch her typing furiously, only for her to lock her screen when I walked into the room. But she'd smile, pull me into conversation, and I'd let it slide. I told myself it was just the strain of work or stress, though I could feel that invisible thread of trust growing taut, stretching under the weight of something I couldn't quite define. It was on a cold Thursday morning, after we'd rushed through our usual chaotic routine of getting the kids ready for school, that things began to shift. As we loaded up the car, her phone slipped from her bag onto the seat. Claire didn't notice as she climbed out, saying she'd be just a minute to grab a quick coffee. She was usually so cautious with her phone, practically glued to it, and it took me a second to process that she'd left it there, unlocked. I glanced down, telling myself I was just going to look at the time. But right as I picked it up, a message flashed across the screen, "Can't wait for tonight, beautiful." I read it again, hoping it would magically transform into something less damning. It didn't. The message was from a contact saved only as N. I felt my stomach drop, but I managed to play it cool when she got back in the car. She didn't even seem to realize her phone had been touched. My mind raced the whole way to work, replaying every late night, every work trip, every time she'd been just a little too quick to lock her phone. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself. Maybe N was a coworker, a friend. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the kind of message coworkers send each other. I spent the next few days pretending everything was normal, biding my time, waiting to gather more information. That weekend, while she was in the shower, I picked up her phone again, my hands slightly shaking as I unlocked it. My search confirmed what I dreaded. N had been texting her almost daily, their exchanges full of inside jokes and late-night promises. The messages were cryptic enough not to leave a clear trail, but reading between the lines, I could tell they weren't talking about work. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of clarity. It was as if a film had lifted, and I could see everything with brutal clarity. I remembered every late night she'd brushed off, every work dinner that had gone late into the night. I wanted to confront her right then, to throw the phone on the floor and demand answers. But something held me back, a quiet voice telling me to wait, to gather proof, to think through every move before confronting her. The following week, I made up an excuse about needing extra hours at the office and left before she did each day, allowing me some time alone. I went through our phone bill, meticulously noting every number she'd called, every late-night conversation that went on far longer than I could justify. The phone number for N was there, over and over, mostly on nights when she'd been out, networking. I was on edge, each discovery eating away at me until I barely recognized the man I saw in the mirror. When the truth became undeniable, I set my plan in motion. I was calm, collected, everything she wasn't when I finally confronted her. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, the kids asleep upstairs. She was at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone with that slightly guilty expression I'd grown so used to. "Claire," I started, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. She looked up, a shadow of surprise flickering across her face as I met her gaze steadily. "What's up?" she asked, her smile a little too bright, too eager. I need to ask you something, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Who's N? For a brief moment, her face betrayed her, a flash of guilt that she quickly smoothed over. Oh, it's just someone from work, she said, her voice too casual, her eyes skimming over me before returning to her phone. Really? I continued, leaning forward slightly. Because I've seen the messages, Claire. I know you're not talking about work with him. Her fingers tightened around the phone, her face pale. She hesitated, scrambling for a response, before finally meeting my gaze. It's complicated. I mean, it's not what you think, but, she stopped, her voice faltering. Not what I think. I echoed, feeling the simmering anger I'd been holding back. Claire, I've seen the messages. I've seen the calls. Every late-night text, every excuse. Just tell me the truth. For a moment, her facade crumbled. She looked at me, truly looked at me, as if seeing the hurt on my face for the first time. I'm sorry, she whispered, almost inaudibly. And then, the floodgates opened. She blamed the stress, the loneliness, the feeling of being neglected. Said it was a moment of weakness, that it didn't mean anything. The excuses flowed, each one weaker than the last. I let her talk, listening as she spun her web of justifications. But I'd already decided. There was no going back now, no repairing what she'd broken. I'd held up my end of the bargain, stayed faithful, trusted her. And she'd thrown it away. When she finally stopped, looking at me with tear-filled eyes, I only nodded. I'm done, I said simply. You can figure out the rest. And with that, I left the room, leaving her standing there, her carefully crafted excuses hanging in the air. That night, I booked a room in a nearby hotel, determined to think through my next steps. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange sense of peace. The betrayal had cut deep, but I had something Claire didn't, control over what came next. I woke up the next morning in that sterile, unfamiliar hotel room, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind. For a few seconds, I felt disoriented, still expecting to hear the sounds of my kids running through the hallway or the familiar hum of the morning news Claire always insisted on playing too loudly. But instead, there was only silence, punctuated by the occasional hum of traffic outside. As I showered and dressed, I replayed our confrontation over and over. I thought about her hollow apologies, her string of excuses that somehow managed to shift the blame onto me. I realized that even as she tried to piece together some kind of explanation, she hadn't once apologized for the pain she'd caused, only for letting things get complicated. My hurt and anger had taken root, twisting inside me into something colder, more calculating. I'd spent years trusting her, standing by her, supporting her through every late night, every work commitment, every business trip she had to take. She thought she could walk all over that, over me, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. That afternoon, I called into work, letting my boss know I was taking a few days off to sort out a family emergency. I made sure the kids were with my parents, knowing they were the last thing I wanted to expose to the fallout that was coming. I returned to the house when I knew Claire wouldn't be there, eager to get my hands on her phone records, emails, any financial transactions that might confirm what I already knew. If she wanted to lie and manipulate, I was going to make sure I had every last fact at my fingertips. It didn't take long. A quick search through our shared phone account, and I had pages of call records. N had become a familiar presence in Claire's digital life, not just through messages and calls but through transactions too. Hotel receipts, dinner charges, charges for flowers and gifts I'd never seen. It was as if our marriage had existed on two parallel tracks, one where I was the husband, provider, father to our kids, and another where she was someone else's companion, indulging in moments I'd never been part of. A cold anger gripped me as I flipped through the records, page after page, each line tightening the knot in my chest. I felt the initial sting of hurt dull, replaced by a bitter resolve. If she wanted to throw away our marriage, I'd make sure it didn't come cheap. That night, I finally called a lawyer. The woman who answered the phone was brisk and efficient, quickly taking my information and setting up an initial consultation for the following day. When she asked for details, I gave her a brief overview, my voice steady as I described Claire's infidelity, the lies she'd told, the time she'd spent with N that was stolen from our family. The attorney listened carefully, only occasionally breaking in to ask questions. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of power return to me. I was moving forward, crafting my response. If Claire thought she could trample on everything we'd built, she was in for a wake-up call. I spent the rest of the night at the hotel, drafting a list of everything I wanted from the divorce, full custody of the kids, the house, and a fair division of our assets. I was already preparing for her to fight me on it, but I knew I was ready for whatever tricks she'd try to pull. The next day, I walked into the lawyer's office, dressed sharply and ready to lay everything out. My attorney, a shrewd woman named Ms. Clark, listened intently, taking notes as I detailed every discovery, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Her lips tightened as I described the hotel receipts, the constant calls, the moments when she'd been unreachable or quick to lock her phone when I walked into a room. Ms. Clark nodded approvingly when I mentioned gathering records and securing all the paperwork. She advised me to freeze any joint accounts to prevent Claire from withdrawing or hiding assets. As I left her office, I felt a surge of anticipation. It was no longer just about getting back at Claire, it was about reclaiming my life, taking control of a future she'd so recklessly jeopardized. When I returned home, Claire was waiting for me, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in her hand. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. I could see the guilt in her face, a silent plea hanging between us. But I wasn't here for apologies or explanations. You left without saying anything, she said quietly. I didn't know if you were coming back. I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. I needed some space. Figured you'd understand. Her face crumpled slightly. I know I hurt you, she whispered. I've been thinking, about what I did, about how much I regret it. It was almost laughable, this sudden burst of remorse. I had waited years for her to acknowledge any faults, and now, when it was too late, she was playing the part of the repentant wife. But I wasn't falling for it. Regret, huh? I said, folding my arms. I bet you weren't thinking about regrets when you were with him, Claire. Or when you lied to me night after night. Her mouth opened and closed as if searching for words. I know I messed up, but, can't we try to work through this? I let out a bitter laugh. Now you want to work through it? After everything? After you went out of your way to lie, to betray me? I watched as her shoulders slumped, the fight draining from her eyes. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but the feeling passed as quickly as it came. My sympathy had long since run dry. You made your choice, Claire, I continued, my voice low but firm. And now I'm making mine. I'll be meeting with the lawyer tomorrow to start the divorce process. You can pack your things and find somewhere else to stay. Her face fell, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. Please, don't do this, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Think about the kids, about everything we've built. I know I made a mistake, but I'm willing to fix it, to do whatever it takes. I shook my head, unmoved by her pleas. It's too late, Claire. You threw away our marriage the moment you decided to step outside of it. There's no going back from that. She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears, but I didn't flinch. The power had shifted, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate me with empty apologies. I left her there, watching as I turned my back and walked out of the room, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls as I worked with Ms. Clark to finalize the divorce arrangements. I set up a new bank account, one that Claire wouldn't have access to, and transferred all of my earnings into it. I listed out every joint asset, every financial investment we had, ensuring that everything was accounted for and protected. I knew Claire would try to fight me on it, to claw back whatever she could, but I was ready. As the details of the divorce started coming together, I began feeling a strange sense of peace, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I'd been wrapped up in trying to please Claire, to keep her happy and fulfilled, even at my own expense. But now, for the first time, I was focusing on what mattered to me, the kids, my own future, my own happiness. I decided to stay in the house, at least until everything was finalized. Claire packed her things and moved out, her eyes lingering on me as if hoping I'd change my mind. But I didn't. I was done playing the part of the forgiving husband, done sacrificing my own well-being for someone who had only seen me as a convenience. The kids were resilient, bouncing back faster than I'd expected. I told them that their mom had to go away for a while, that things would be different but that they'd still see her. They asked a few questions, but for the most part, they took it in stride. I made sure they knew they were my top priority, that nothing would change between us. And as for Claire, I barely thought about her. I saw her once or twice when she came to pick up the kids, looking worn and defeated. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of any more arguments or confrontations. She was just a figure in the background now, a chapter one was ready to close. As I stood in my empty home that night, looking around at the walls that had once held memories of a life I thought was real, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. Claire's betrayal had shattered my illusions, but in the process, it had set me free. I was finally in control of my own life, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that away from me again. The days turned into weeks, and life settled into a new kind of rhythm. Claire moved into a small apartment across town, close enough to see the kids on her designated weekends. The final terms of the divorce agreement were still in the works, but for now, the arrangement was steady. I'd reclaimed the house, the routines, and most importantly, a sense of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. But even with Claire out of the picture, a deep bitterness lingered, a kind of anger that didn't fade easily. I didn't trust anyone, not family, not friends, not myself. It was like a bad taste in my mouth, and I found myself going over every conversation, every memory, wondering how I could have missed the signs, how I'd ignored my instincts for so long. I'd been the fool, and the shame of it was almost as painful as the betrayal itself. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the last details of our finances. Claire had pushed back on the initial terms, insisting on more than what we'd originally agreed. I could feel her fingerprints all over the documents, little notes and addendums in legal language, likely crafted to wring every last cent she could get. It wasn't about the money, it was about control. She was desperate to hang on to the life she'd thrown away, clawing at whatever scraps she could still call hers. Let her try, I muttered, my voice echoing in the empty kitchen. I'd already decided that I'd fight her for every inch. She had made her bed, and I wasn't about to let her sneak back into mine. Around that time, I began noticing her attempts to reel me back in. She'd call about the kids, asking questions about their schoolwork, their schedules, small things that a quick text could have covered. She would linger a moment too long at drop-offs, her voice softening as she told me how much she missed them, how much she missed us. She'd leave little traces of herself, an old mug she claimed to have forgotten, a sweater she'd left on the sofa as if it belonged there. It was subtle, a slow creep of nostalgia she was trying to push onto me. But I was onto her. I kept every interaction as brief and detached as possible, treating her like any other co-parent. Her attempts at softening the blow only made me more resolved to see things through to the bitter end. I didn't want her back. I didn't want her hovering at the edges of my life. She'd become an intruder in her own home, a reminder of every lie, every betrayal. And I was done playing along. Then one Saturday, Claire dropped off the kids for the weekend. She lingered on the porch, her arms crossed as she looked at me with a sad, hesitant expression. "Can we talk, James?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I could see the vulnerability she was trying to project, the remorse pooling in her eyes. About what? I replied, leaning against the doorframe. She looked down, wringing her hands. I don't want things to be like this, she said, her voice breaking. I miss our life together. I know I made a mistake, but I'd do anything to fix it if I could. I studied her face, trying to summon any of the feelings I once had for her, any glimmer of sympathy. But there was nothing, only a hollow emptiness where love had once been. It's too late for that, Claire, I said, keeping my tone as even as possible. We're past fixing things. You made your choice, and I've made mine. She looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. I was confused, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never wanted to hurt you, James. I didn't know how to tell you I was unhappy. A cold laugh slipped out before I could stop it. So your solution was to cheat? To lie? You expect me to feel sorry for you because you didn't have the courage to tell me the truth? She flinched, as if the words had physically struck her. I know I was wrong, she said, her voice cracking. But don't you think we owe it to ourselves, to our kids, to at least try? I'm willing to go to counseling, to do whatever it takes. I'm done, Claire, I interrupted, cutting her off. I don't want counseling. I don't want second chances. I want my life back. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked utterly defeated. You can't just shut me out, she said softly, her voice barely audible. Watch me, I replied, closing the door firmly. I leaned against it, listening as her footsteps faded down the driveway, a strange mixture of relief and finality settling over me. With Claire gone, I finally allowed myself to feel the weight of the moment, the satisfaction of reclaiming my own space, my own life. I had taken back control, refused to let her manipulate me with guilt and regret. For the first time, I felt truly free. The next few weeks passed with a newfound sense of calm. I was back at work, back to my routines, and slowly but surely, the memories of Claire's betrayal began to fade. I poured my energy into my job, focusing on projects that had been on the back burner for months. My friends rallied around me, reminding me of the life I'd almost forgotten, the life I could build on my own terms. But just as I was beginning to feel like I'd put it all behind me, an unexpected call disrupted my newfound peace. It was late on a Wednesday night, the kids already in bed, when my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen, frowning as I saw Claire's name flashing. I hesitated before picking up, expecting another attempt at a plea for forgiveness. But her voice was different this time, low and tense. James, she said, barely above a whisper. I need your help. My first instinct was to tell her to handle her problems on her own, but something in her tone made me pause. What's going on? She took a shaky breath. I'm being evicted. The apartment, it's not safe anymore. I made a mistake, James. I thought I could handle everything on my own, but, her voice trailed off, and I could hear the desperation beneath her words. It was almost surreal, hearing her admit to needing me after everything that had happened. Part of me felt a twisted satisfaction, a sense of justice in her suffering. But as much as I wanted to revel in her misery, the practical side of me knew I had to keep things civil, if only for the kid's sake. Fine, I said coolly. I'll help you get through this, but don't mistake this for anything more than it is. You're the mother of my children, and that's the only reason I'm stepping in. There was a pause, a heavy silence as she absorbed my words. Thank you, James, she whispered, her voice choked. I won't forget this. We agreed that she'd come by the house the following day to go over her options. As I ended the call, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This wasn't forgiveness. This was my way of asserting my own boundaries, of showing her that I was in control now. The next evening, Claire showed up looking worn, her face drawn and pale. We sat in the living room, a tense silence filling the space between us as we went over her situation. She had overextended herself, taken on a lease she couldn't afford, and burned through her savings trying to keep up appearances. It was almost laughable, the lengths she'd gone to in order to maintain the illusion of independence. "Why didn't you just ask for help sooner?" I asked, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "I thought I could handle it on my own. I didn't want to burden you." "Burden me?" I echoed, the irony of her words almost too much to bear. "You were willing to throw everything away, and now you're worried about being a burden?" She flinched, her shoulders slumping as she nodded. "I know I don't deserve your help. But I didn't know who else to turn to." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. This wasn't about pity or second chances, it was about responsibility. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could make sure the fallout didn't destroy everything. I agreed to help her find a new place, to provide some temporary financial support for the kids' sake. But I made it clear that this was it, that once she was back on her feet, she was on her own. When she finally left that night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a finality I hadn't felt before. Claire had made her choices, and now she was reaping the consequences. For the first time, I was in control, free to move forward without the shadow of her betrayal hanging over me. In that moment, I realized I didn't need revenge. The satisfaction of watching her unravel, of seeing her struggle to pick up the pieces of her own mistakes, was all the closure I needed. And as I closed the door behind her, I knew I was ready to rebuild, to move on, and to create a life that was mine and mine alone. In the weeks that followed, life started to take on a calm, steady rhythm. I was working harder than ever, taking on extra hours to secure my financial stability and ensure that the kids had everything they needed. My home was peaceful, free of the tension that had haunted every room in those final months with Claire. I'd even started seeing an old friend from college. The tentative beginnings of something new, something I could have never anticipated, felt like a fresh start. But then, one Friday evening, I received a call that I couldn't have prepared for. I was at home, reviewing a project from work when my phone rang, the name on the screen causing a brief flash of irritation, Claire. I hesitated before picking it up, bracing myself for yet another request, another conversation that I wasn't in the mood for. "James," her voice was trembling, shaky, almost unrecognizable. I don't know who else to call. Can you please come to the apartment? It's an emergency." My instinct was to brush it off, to tell her to handle whatever crisis she'd created. But something in her tone, a genuine sense of fear, gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I told her I'd be there in half an hour. The drive was tense. I wasn't sure what I was about to walk into, but my mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. When I pulled up to her apartment building, the lights in her window were off, casting the place in an eerie silence. My stomach churned as I made my way to her door, knocking and waiting for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she opened it, and the sight of her stopped me cold. Claire looked pale, her face drawn and gaunt, eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She was trembling as she led me inside, shutting the door quietly behind us. I took in the sparse surroundings, the boxes half-packed, the emptiness that clung to every corner of the room. She hadn't told me she was moving again. "What's going on, Claire?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't look at me, wringing her hands as she stared at the floor. "I know I've asked too much of you already," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to talk to you. Really talk. There are things I haven't told you." I crossed my arms, wary but willing to listen. "Fine. I'm here." She looked up at me, her eyes glassy, and in that moment, I saw a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. "I thought I could handle things on my own, you know. After the divorce. I wanted to prove that I could do it, that I didn't need you." She paused, swallowing hard. "But it's been harder than I ever thought. And it's not just the money, or the loneliness. I felt a surge of frustration mixed with a hint of pity, but I kept my voice even. Then what is it, Claire? What's really going on? She took a shaky breath. I didn't want you to know, but I've been sick, James. Her voice broke, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold together the fragments of her composure. It started a few months ago, small things, mostly. Headaches, feeling tired all the time. But then it got worse. I thought it was just stress, but then I felt my heart sink, my mind scrambling to process what she was saying. Claire, I said quietly, stepping toward her. Have you seen a doctor? She nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. They ran tests. It's advanced. I ignored it too long, and now, they're saying it might be too late. My mind went blank as her words settled like stones in my stomach. Cancer. The kind that goes undetected, the kind that sneaks up when you're too wrapped up in life to notice. I felt a wave of disbelief, anger, and a helpless sorrow wash over me all at once. She was supposed to be my enemy, the woman who betrayed me. But now, standing in front of me, she was the mother of my children, the woman I'd once loved, someone facing something no one should have to endure alone. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She shrugged, the weight of her own mistakes etched in the lines of her face. Pride, I guess. Shame. I didn't want you to pity me. I didn't want anyone to. But now I don't know what to do. Without thinking, I reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and for the first time in what felt like years, I saw the Claire I'd fallen in love with, the woman before the lies, before the betrayal. The woman who, despite everything, had been my partner, my friend, the mother of my children. What do you need from me? I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She looked at me, her face softening, and I could see the glimmer of hope in her eyes. Just, your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, I know that. But I can't. I can't leave this world without trying to make things right between us. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, a tear I hadn't realized I was holding back. I couldn't bring myself to say it, but as I wrapped my arms around her, she broke down, sobbing into my chest. The resentment, the bitterness, it all seemed so small, so irrelevant in the face of the brutal reality we were both confronting. In the days that followed, I found myself navigating a world I never anticipated. Claire moved back into the house, and we told the kids together, doing our best to prepare them for what was coming. We made every moment count, every day a memory, though it tore me apart inside to see her grow weaker with each passing week. As her condition worsened, I was by her side, the final barriers between us stripped away. We talked for hours, unraveling old memories, forgiving each other, rebuilding the pieces of a broken love we'd thought was gone forever. It was strange, comforting her, letting go of the hurt, the anger. In her final weeks, we found a peace that had once seemed impossible. And then, one morning, as I sat by her bed, holding her frail hand, she looked at me, her eyes soft and full of the love we'd nearly forgotten. Thank you, James, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For everything. I squeezed her hand, feeling the tears blur my vision. No, Claire. Thank you. In those final moments, we were simply two people who had loved each other, who had hurt and healed, forgiven and remembered. And as she slipped away, I felt the pain of her loss settle deep in my heart, mingling with a sense of closure and a sadness that would linger forever. After her passing, I kept her memory alive for the kids, sharing stories of the woman she'd been before everything changed, the mother who had loved them fiercely. And though I was left with a heart scarred by loss and betrayal, I found that her final gift, a painful, honest forgiveness, was enough to help me heal. Life went on, as it always does. I missed her even with all the hurt she'd caused, because at the end of it all, we had shared something that went deeper than any betrayal, a bond forged by love, regret, and the brutal beauty of saying goodbye.